They blocked my driveway without asking, and for a moment I just stood there in the street staring at it like maybe I was missing something obvious. Like maybe there was some reasonable explanation for why a pile of gravel, orange cones, and a cement mixer were sitting exactly where my car was supposed to go. But there wasn't. And the longer I looked, the more it sank, and that this wasn't an accident. This was planned, approved, and carried out like my property didn't even exist. I had just gotten back from a doctor's appointment. Nothing dramatic, just a routine follow-up. And I remember feeling tired, a little out of it. The kind of quiet afternoon where all you want is to pull into your driveway, shut the door, and sit down for a minute. But instead, I was parked halfway on the curb, engine still running, watching two guys in neon vests smooth out fresh concrete like they were icing a cake that just happened to run across the entrance to my home. I stepped out of the car, and the first thing I noticed was how permanent it all looked. Like this wasn't some temporary setup that could be moved in an hour. This was layers of gravel packed tight, forms already set, concrete being poured, and right there, zip-tied to my mailbox like a bad joke, was a laminated notice from the HOA. It had that cheerful tone they always use, the kind that makes everything sound reasonable if you don't think about it too hard. Something about a neighborhood enhancement project, temporary inconvenience, estimated completion in 2 to 3 weeks. Thank you for your patience. And I actually laughed out loud reading that. Just one short breath of disbelief, because patience wasn't really the issue here. Access was. I walked over to the nearest guy who looked like he might be in charge. Mid-40s, sunburnt neck, clipboard tucked under his arm, and I asked him calmly at first, "Hey, can you tell me what's going on here?" He barely looked at me, just gestured with his chin toward the wet concrete and said, "Sidewalk extension, HOA job." Like that explained everything. And when I pointed behind him, directly at my blocked driveway, he shrugged, actually shrugged, and said, "You'll have to take that up with them. I just pour what they pay for." There's a specific kind of frustration that hits when someone says something like that. Because it's not wrong. It's just useless. And I could feel it building in my chest as I stepped back, pulled out my phone, and called the one person I knew would give me a straight answer. Or at least I thought he would. A guy named Marcus Holloway, vice president of the HOA, the kind of guy who always had an opinion about everything, especially things that didn't belong to him. He picked up on the second ring, and before I even finished explaining, he cut me off with that same tone I'd heard in a dozen community meetings. Half polite, half dismissive, like he was already done with the conversation. "Yeah, we sent out notices about that," he said. "It's a temporary inconvenience. You can just park on the street for a couple weeks." A couple weeks. He said it like it was nothing, like blocking someone's driveway was the same as repainting a fence or trimming a hedge. And when I told him that they had literally sealed off access to private property, he chuckled, actually chuckled, and said, "Come on, it's not that serious. This is going to raise property values for everyone, including you." That was the moment something shifted. Not anger, exactly, more like clarity, because it wasn't about the driveway anymore. It was about the assumption underneath it that they could make decisions like this without even checking, that they could inconvenience someone indefinitely and brush it off as community improvement. And I realized, standing there in the street with my car idling and wet concrete drying in front of me, that this wasn't going to get fixed with a polite conversation. I hung up, took a slow breath, and instead of arguing with the crew or pacing around like I wanted to, I just walked the site step by step, looking at what they were actually building. Because if there's one thing I learned from my dad, it's that every construction project tells a story if you know where to look. And this one didn't take long to start unraveling. The sidewalk they were pouring curved neatly along the cul-de-sac. Wide, decorative, clearly more about aesthetics than function. But right where it passed my property line, it crossed something most people wouldn't even notice, unless they knew to look for it. A graded storm drain set low into the curb. Now that drain had been there longer than any of the houses, older than the HOA itself. And more importantly, it wasn't just a random piece of infrastructure. It was part of a drainage line that ran directly under my backyard. Something I only knew because my father had kept every survey, every blueprint, every boring detail about this property in a thick folder in the garage. The kind of thing most people throw away until they suddenly need it. I crouched down and looked closer, watching how the fresh concrete was being shaped around the edges of the drain, how the grades seemed just slightly off. Like whoever planned this cared more about how it looked than how water actually moved. And that's when the first rail thought hit me, not fully formed, just a quiet, steady realization that they might have made a mistake. Not a small one either, something structural, something that wouldn't show up until it was too late to ignore. I went back inside, dug through the old cabinet where I kept my dad's files, and found the survey maps yellowed at the edges, but still perfectly readable. And as I spread them out on the kitchen table, tracing the lines with my finger, everything started to line up. The drain, the culvert, the easement boundaries, and right there in the notes, clear as day, was a clause about any construction within 50 feet of the main drainage line requiring formal approval and inspection. I leaned back in my chair, staring at that line for a long second because I already knew the answer before I even checked. They hadn't approved anything, they hadn't inspected anything, they hadn't even bothered to ask. And suddenly the situation in front of me didn't feel like a dead end anymore. It felt like an opening, and that's when I decided I wasn't going to argue with them. Not yet. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was stressed, but because my brain wouldn't shut off. It just kept turning the same idea over and over, testing it, poking at it, making sure it wasn't just frustration dressed up as logic. Because if I was going to push back on something like this, I needed to be right. Not just technically, but completely the kind of right that holds up when people start asking questions, when lawyers get involved, when everyone suddenly pretends they care about details they ignored before. So around 6 the next morning, coffee still too hot to drink, I called the county engineering office and explained what I'd seen. Tried to keep it simple, factual, no emotion, just the location, the construction, and the potential issue with the drainage line. And to my surprise, they didn't brush me off. The woman on the phone paused, asked a few very specific questions, then said, "We'll send someone out today." That alone told me everything I needed to know. By mid-morning, a county inspector named Alvarez pulled up in a white truck, the kind that's seen a lot of job sites, and within 10 minutes of walking the area, he had that look on his face, the one professionals get when they realize someone skipped a step they really shouldn't have. He didn't say much at first, just took photos, checked measurements, flipped through a set of plans the crew handed him, and then finally asked, "Who approved this work near the main line?" The foreman gave the same answer he gave me, "HOA job," like that was a magic stamp of authority, and Alvarez just shook his head slightly, not dramatic, just enough to say this wasn't going to go the way they expected. An hour later, the entire site went quiet. No more concrete, no more smoothing, no more casual shrugging, just a bright orange notice taped to one of the cones, official, unmistakable, a stop work order issued by the county due to unapproved construction within a regulated drainage easement. I stood on my porch watching it all happen, not celebrating, not yet, just observing how quickly confidence drains out of a situation when someone with actual authority steps in, and for a brief moment I thought that might be the end of it, that they'd fix the mistake, clear my driveway, maybe even apologize, and we'd all move on. But then Marcus showed up. He didn't call first, didn't text, just pulled up in his SUV, stepped out like he was walking into a meeting he planned to win, and came straight toward me with that tight smile that never quite reaches the eyes. "You went to the county?" he asked. Not really a question, more like an accusation. And I nodded because there wasn't any point pretending otherwise. He let out a short breath, looked back at the halted construction, then said, "You could have just talked to us." I almost laughed at that, but instead I said, "I did talk to you. You told me to park on the street for a few weeks." His smile thinned just a little, and for the first time, there was a crack in that easy confidence. "This is going to delay the entire project," he said. "Do you have any idea how many people this affects?" And there it was again, that same framing, like I was the problem now, like I had caused this inconvenience by pointing out something they should have checked in the first place. "I'm aware," I said, "and I'm also aware that you blocked access to my property without permission. So I guess we're both learning something." He didn't like that. You could see it in the way his posture shifted, the way his voice dropped just enough to carry weight without raising volume. "Look," he said, "we'll sort out the permits, get the county what they need, and this will be back on track in a day or two. So let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." And that was the moment I understood his angle. He wasn't apologizing. He was minimizing, trying to compress the situation into something temporary again, something manageable, something that didn't require accountability. So I nodded like I agreed, like I was satisfied, and said, "Sure, we'll see how it plays out." What I didn't say, what I didn't even hint at, was that I had already moved past that version of the outcome, because stopping their project wasn't the point anymore. That afternoon, I made a few calls of my own, not to argue, not to complain, but to set something in motion, something completely within my rights, something that didn't rely on their approval or their timeline. By 3 o'clock, a small crew was in my backyard, guys I'd worked with before on a retaining wall project, people who understood permits, measurements, and most importantly, how to follow instructions without asking unnecessary questions. I showed them the survey, pointed out the drainage inlet on my side of the property, and explained exactly what I wanted done. One of them looked at me for a second, then said, "You sure about this?" Not skeptical, just making sure I understood the implications, because once concrete sets, it doesn't negotiate. "I'm sure," I said. Everything we did was by the book. Permit filed, approved, materials delivered, no shortcuts, no gray areas, just a straightforward modification on my own property, reinforcing the drainage boundary in a way that happened to include a solid concrete barrier right across the inlet point. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, just a clean, deliberate structure that redirected water flow, technically improving my property's protection against runoff. And legally, there wasn't a thing anyone could say about it. By the time the sun started to dip, it was done. I stood there for a minute, hands in my pockets, looking at it, not with excitement, but with a kind of quiet certainty, because this wasn't about revenge in the way people usually think about it. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no big moment, just a decision made calmly and carried out completely, the kind that doesn't feel loud at all until the consequences start showing up. And the consequences, I knew, were just a matter of timing. That night the forecast called for rain. Nothing extreme, just a steady system moving through, the kind of thing most people wouldn't even think twice about. But as I sat on my porch listening to the first drops hit the roof, I couldn't help noticing how the air felt heavier, how the ground seemed to hold that moisture a little longer, like it was preparing for something. By morning it had started, not all at once, not dramatic, just water doing what water always does, following the easiest path available, except now that path had changed. I stepped outside with my coffee, the same routine as any other day, but the street looked different, the surface darker, small pools forming where there hadn't been any before. And as the rain continued, those pools didn't drain the way they used to. They spread slowly at first, then more noticeably, creeping along the edges of driveways, collecting in low spots, testing boundaries that had always held before. Across the cul-de-sac, I saw Mrs. Langford open her garage, step out, and immediately pause, looking down at the water gathering near her tires, confusion written all over her face. A few houses down, someone else came out, then another, each one noticing the same thing at slightly different moments. That subtle shift from normal to not quite right, the kind of change people try to explain away until they can't anymore. By mid-morning, it wasn't subtle. The water had nowhere to go. It filled the street, rose inch by inch, pushing up against curbs, spilling into driveways, seeping under garage doors that were never meant to hold back anything more than dust. Cars sat lower in it than they should have, reflections rippling across hoods that had never seen more than a passing drizzle. And the entire neighborhood, the same one that had brushed off my inconvenience as temporary, was now dealing with something they couldn't park around or ignore for a few weeks. I took a slow sip of coffee, watching it all unfold, and for the first time since this started, I allowed myself to think it. Now they'll understand. By early afternoon, the whole cul-de-sac had turned into something that didn't even look real anymore, like one of those before and after shots you see on the news, except this wasn't a storm surge or a broken dam. It was just rain, steady and ordinary, exposing a problem that had been sitting there the entire time, waiting for the right conditions. The water had climbed high enough to swallow the lower halves of tires, creeping up garage lips, slipping through seams people didn't even know existed, and everywhere you looked, there were neighbors standing in it, shoes soaked, voices raised, phones out, trying to figure out who to call, what to do, how something like this could even happen in a place that prided itself on being so well managed. I stayed on my porch, not hiding, not avoiding, just staying dry. There's a strange clarity that comes when you stop reacting and just observe, and I remember noticing small details, the way the water moved in slow currents along the curb, the way reflections of houses bent and broke with every ripple, the way people who had waved politely for years were now arguing in the middle of the street like none of that history mattered. It wasn't chaos exactly. but it was close enough that you could feel it building. That pressure that comes when a system fails and nobody wants to admit why. It didn't take long for Marcus to show up. This time there was no confident stride, no controlled smile, just urgency, the kind that makes people forget how they usually present themselves. He was already wet by the time he reached my steps. Dress shoes darkened, pant legs soaked halfway up his calves. And for a second he just stood there, catching his breath like he'd run the whole way. "We've got a serious problem," he said, stating the obvious in a voice that finally sounded like it belonged to a real situation. I leaned back slightly against the door frame, coffee still warm in my hand, and said, "Looks like it." His eyes flicked past me toward the backyard, toward the area he now knew mattered, and then back to me. "You need to remove that barrier," he said. More direct this time, less performance, more demand. "The drainage isn't working. The whole street is flooding." I let a second pass before answering, not to be dramatic, just to make sure the moment landed where it needed to. "I'd love to help," I said, "but my driveway is still blocked. Can't get any equipment back there." For a split second he didn't respond. You could see the calculation happening, the realization settling in, the way the situation had shifted from something he controlled to something he didn't. "We can clear that," he said quickly, almost tripping over the words. "I'll call the crew right now. We'll move whatever's in the way." I shook my head just slightly. "You said a couple weeks," I reminded him, keeping my tone even, not aggressive, just consistent. "Temporary inconvenience, right?" That hit harder than anything else I could have said, because now it wasn't about the water anymore. It was about the conversation we'd already had, the way it had been dismissed, minimized, brushed aside. And suddenly those same words didn't sound so reasonable, when the inconvenience belonged to everyone, instead of just me. He exhaled, ran a hand through his wet hair, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked unsure. Simple question, but it carried everything. I set the coffee down on the railing, took a step forward, and said, "I want this handled properly, not patched over. My driveway cleared today, not eventually, and I want compensation for the damage, the disruption, all of it." He blinked. "Compensation. 15,000. I said, not raising my voice, not negotiating yet, just putting the number in the air where it could settle. He stared at me like I'd just suggested something outrageous. But then he glanced back at the street, at the water still rising inch by inch, at neighbors now calling out to him specifically. And you could see the math change in real time. This wasn't about principle anymore. It was about cost, about liability, about how quickly a bad decision could spiral into something much bigger. "I can't just approve that," he said, but the certainty was gone. "Then get the board," I replied, "because this doesn't get fixed until we have an agreement." The next couple of days blurred together in that strange way stressful situations do, where time feels both stretched and compressed. Every hour full of activity, but somehow leading back to the same problem. Pumps showed up, then stopped. Calls were made, then escalated. Insurance adjusters walked through flooded garages taking photos, asking questions nobody wanted to answer directly. And through all of it, the water stayed not rising as fast, but not going anywhere either, just sitting there as a constant reminder that something fundamental had been ignored. By the third day, the HOA called an emergency meeting, not at the clubhouse, because that was still dealing with water damage, but at the local library, a space that suddenly felt a lot less formal than their usual setup, folding chairs instead of polished tables, voices carrying a little too easily in the open room. I showed up on time, sat near the back, and watched as the same people who had approved the project now spoke in careful, measured tones about unforeseen complications and the need for swift resolution. Marcus did most of the talking. He laid out the situation without assigning blame, which was impressive in its own way. And then he got to the part that mattered, the proposed settlement, the terms they were prepared to agree to in order to restore normal drainage and prevent further damage. When he said the number, there was a small ripple through the room. Not outrage, more like reluctant acceptance, because at that point everyone understood what the alternative looked like. They voted. It wasn't unanimous, but it didn't need to be. Afterward, Marcus walked over, check already in hand, and for a moment neither of us said anything, because everything that needed to be said had already happened out there in the water, in the delay, in the consequences. He handed it to me, and I took it, glanced down just long enough to confirm, then folded it once and slipped it into my jacket pocket. "You'll remove it?" he asked. I nodded. "Driveway first." That part happened fast. Within hours, the same crew that had blocked my access was back. This time, moving with a kind of urgency that hadn't been there before, clearing gravel, shifting equipment, cutting a clean path back to my garage like it had always been that way. And once I could pull my car in again, once that simple basic right was restored, I made a call of my own. The barrier came down the next morning. Not dramatically, no crowd, no announcement, just concrete being broken apart piece by piece, until the inlet opened again, and the water finally had somewhere to go. It didn't disappear instantly. Nothing ever does. But over the next several hours, you could see the level drop, slowly revealing pavement, driveways, the edges of lawns that had been underwater just a day before. By evening, it was almost like it hadn't happened. Almost. Because if you looked closely, there were signs, water lines on garage walls, debris caught in corners, a lingering dampness that doesn't go away overnight. And more than that, there was a shift in how people moved through the neighborhood, a little less certainty, a little more awareness that things don't always work the way they're supposed to, just because someone said they would. As for me, my driveway stayed clear. No more tones, no more surprise projects, no more assumptions about what I tolerate without question. And every time it rains now, not even heavy, just enough to make the pavement darken, and the air smell different, I notice how quickly the water finds that drain again, how smoothly it disappears. Like the system is finally being respected for what it is. I kept the paperwork, the permits, the approvals, the receipts, all filed away neatly, not because I expect another problem, but because I understand now how easily one can start when people stop paying attention to the details that actually matter. And sometimes when I see Marcus around, there's this brief moment where we make eye contact. Not hostile, not friendly either, just aware, like we both remember exactly how this played out and what it took to get it resolved. So here's the question I keep coming back to, and I'm honestly curious what you think, because depending on how you look at it, this whole thing can go either way. Was this just someone standing up for their rights when they were ignored? Or did I take it too far by letting the consequences hit everyone else before stepping in? Let me know what you think, because I've heard both sides and I'm not convinced there's a clean answer.